This is Hunter Muse.
And this is Chris Snipes, and you are listening
to The Melt.
So, my name is Rizwan Virk. You can call me Riz, everyone does. And my background is first as a computer scientist, and then as an entrepreneur in Silicon Valley. And then I became an investor, particularly in the video game industry, which is where my last company was. We had the #1 game in the App Store for a while. We sold it. Then I ran a startup program at MIT, which is where I got my computer science degree as well, over at the media lab called Play Labs, which was for companies doing playful technologies. So my day job has been, really as a technologist and a Silicon Valley person with a particular focus on video games. And then, while I was doing all that, I was living kind of a double life, where I would often explore different aspects of consciousness, whether it was through meditation or I would go to shamanic journeying retreats up at Gore Mountain in upstate New York, or down to the Monroe Institute in was it West Virginia or somewhere down there, which is, doing out-of-body experiences, or I would be experimenting with lucid dreaming. And so I had this kind of double life for a long time. And then back in 2019, on the 20th anniversary of The Matrix, I wrote the book, The Simulation Hypothesis, which is about the idea that we live actually inside a video game. And that allowed me to bring together my interests in consciousness, spirituality, as well as technology and science, kind of like my day job and my weekend hobbies together into one. Currently I'm at Arizona State University. I'm teaching classes on virtual reality, the metaverse, and the first college level class on this idea that we live inside a simulation, which is called Simulation Theory, Science Fiction, Religion, Philosophy, and Technology, which is pretty interdisciplinary.
Interesting. What kind of reactions are you getting in that class?
Oh, I'm getting great reactions, from the students, because, each of those areas obviously has a lot of potential depth you can go into. And so what I'm trying to do is draw connections. And so, I think it's nice for students to get out of, usually classes go in depth in one of those areas, but here we're trying to make connections, across different areas. And you might have an engineering student who would never take a religious class, right? And we'll be quoting passages from the Quran, for example, and tying them to scenes out of the movie The 13th Floor. And so, I think for that reason, it's a pretty interesting class. I also just offered it online to the public for the first time as well, but it really started at ASU.
Nice. I'll have to look into that. And it's you're offering it every semester, or?
No, I'm offering it once a year at ASU, and then in the spring, and then usually in the fall is when I'm offering it to the public online.
Okay, gotcha.
That way,
cool.
So I'm also getting a PhD currently at ASU as well, something I never did when I was younger. So I'm now doing it a little bit older. Yeah.
Gotcha. ASU's in Tempe, right?
Yes, it's in Tempe, which is just outside of Phoenix.
Yes. Yeah, I spent a little bit of time in Tempe. I thought that I would not like Arizona or the landscape at all, but I really fell in love with it. It's really a wonderful place.
It's great, except for the summer, which is why I'm usually not here in the summer, but usually during the school year, it's beautiful.
Yeah, it's insanely hot in the summer for sure. Well, maybe before we start diving into this, we could establish a few definitions. Like, there's when we say universe or multiverse, that means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And when we say simulation, that means also a lot of different things to a lot of different people. A lot of people immediately think of the Matrix and the obvious sorts of connections with that. But how are you defining those things in the two books that we're mostly going to get into today?
Well, those are actually big questions, right?
True. Take as
Because
much time as you need.
a lot of different areas. So, when I define the simulation, I like to say simply it means that the physical universe that we can see and observe with our eyes and our instruments um, is actually a non-physical uh, universe that is based on information which gets rendered for us. It's like a computer simulation, or it's like a massively multiplayer online role-playing game or a video game. And so there's actually two different flavors of that. They're not mutually exclusive, but it's useful to think of them as two flavors because I think it helps us to understand what different people mean when they talk about the term simulation hypothesis.
Yeah.
And so the one flavor is the RPG version, which stands for role-playing game, which is similar to a video game, where if I play a video game and you play the same video game, let's say we're in Fortnite together, we have our avatars that are hanging out together in the virtual world. But then each of us as a player exists outside of the virtual world.
Yeah.
And so, we have an avatar or a character. Avatar, by the way, comes from an ancient Sanskrit word, which, was used for this idea that divinity, which is very large, kind of squeezes itself down into a human body, right? It comes from the Vedic terminology for a divine figure like a Krishna or even a Jesus Christ, right? Where a divine presence squeezes itself. And so the guys at Lucasfilm, George Lucas's company that he set up after making Star Wars, they were making video games back in the 80s, and they were making a game called Habitat, which was really the first online multiplayer game. It wasn't massively multiplayer. It was on Commodore 64s with, dial-up lines with that old sound that us old guys know, but the young guys have never heard, right? And you had this little 2D sprite character on the screen that was your character, and they were trying to come up with a term and say, well, it felt like taking your big presence outside the computer and squeezing it down into the phone lines into this tiny little figure. And so they used the term avatar. And then, of course, it was popularized by Neil Stephenson in his 1992 sci-fi novel, Cyberpunk, called Snow Crash, where he popularized the term avatar, and now it's used pretty commonly within computers and video games. And so that's one version of the simulation hypothesis, which technically, if you want to get into technical terms, the best name I've heard for that is the matrix hypothesis, which comes from a philosopher named David Chalmers, who's very well known at NYU. And but the idea is that you are a player and you have a character inside the game. So it's like you're in a virtual reality with a virtual reality headset, or like in the Matrix where you have the brain computer interface in the back. The other flavor is the NPC flavor. And NPC stands for non-player characters. So within video games, there's your character, and then there's all the other guys that are controlled by the computer, the bartender, the bank teller, the guy you're shooting with arrows, right? All of these different AI characters, which started off very simple, but now they're becoming more complicated. There's a new term now called smart NPCs, where they're hooking up these NPCs to LLMs, like large language models, which power like GPT, ChatGPT, or Bard, or any of these out there. And so they're starting to be a little more intelligent. But in the NPC version, everyone in the simulation is an AI, meaning they're just part of the computer program. So there is no, outside person, right? There's no player. If there's a player, the player is just kind of watching the whole thing. It's kind of like with The Sims, where we're kind of watching the Sims do their thing, or Sim City, where we're watching a whole civilization do their thing. And so that version, I like to call the NPC version. Technically, that's closer to what Nick Bostrom, who was a philosopher at Oxford, who wrote a paper in 2003 called "Are We Living in a Computer Simulation?" Which is the terminology that has kind of become popular. He used that term for one of his options. We can talk more about his simulation argument, but it relies on large numbers of AI characters, where almost everybody in the simulation is an NPC. that's just run by a computer. And so the idea is these are not totally mutually exclusive, right?
Mhm.
You can actually have player characters, avatars, and NPCs both within the same, within the same game. So you can be in a role-playing game, but that's a good way to think about the various flavors of the simulation hypothesis. Now, when most people think about it, they think of the Matrix
Mhm.
because that was the most popular, not necessarily the best, but the most popular
Yes.
science fiction incarnation of this idea. Certainly one of the best. And so for that reason, they think, Neo and Morpheus and Trinity all existed outside the simulation. So anyway, that was kind of a long answer to your question
Oh,
about how do I define the
yeah.
simulation. Yeah.
No, take as much time as you want. These are big questions, so don't feel like you have to condense or dilute anything for sure. Um, so then there is another big question. Simulation seems to, just by the nature of the word, indicate that something is being imitated, something is being replicated. In this scenario that you posit, or scenarios, what do you think is being simulated? Is there an original version of something that this, we'll say, just for the sake of the argument here, the computer program is trying to imitate?
Yeah, that's a good question. And, the term simulation does, in fact, mean a likeness of.
Mhm.
But, we can think of why do we run simulations, right? So we run simulations perhaps of the weather. So we run these computer programs and we change little variables. Well, what happens if the wind speed changes? Right? Oh, then, the clouds move over here and it's going to rain in, Kansas
Mhm.
and not in Michigan, let's say, for example, right? So we run these simulations to see what is the most likely outcome, or maybe even what's the most optimal outcome, right? We say we run these pandemic simulations or any virus, right? And we see how it might spread.
Mhm.
And in that case, what we're doing is we're creating a scaled down version, right, of something. Now, I mentioned Nick Bostrom earlier, and he came up with the terminology ancestor simulation.
Oh,
And, so he came up with the terminology meaning that an advanced technological civilization would simulate its ancestors. So I brought up like SimCity earlier, or you can think of the game Civilization. But the basic idea would be if we were to simulate ancient Rome or the ancient Greeks or ancient India, right? For example, those would technically be our ancestors, depending on where we're from, right? But we would be simulating what is supposedly, anyway, a simpler version, right? A less technologically advanced civilization.
Mhm.
So in that terminology, we would be a simulation of a future civilization and what they think. Now, that doesn't mean that the simulation has to be exactly like, what's out there,
Sure.
what's called base reality.
Mhm.
So, for example, recently was the Notre Dame, the cathedral in France, in Paris, right? There was a fire,
Yes.
and they wanted to rebuild it. And so, what did they do? They went to a video game company that made a game called Assassin's Creed,
Oh, yeah.
which had already mapped, with LiDAR, like they had a really detailed 3D model of exactly what everything looked like
Interesting.
in the cathedral. And so they used that to reconstruct it. Now, why did they do that? Now, their game, which had very realistic graphics, and this gets to the whole idea of the simulation point and how realistic are our graphics. We can talk about that in a minute as well. But the idea was that the game had very realistic graphics, but it took a different turn, right? It was an Assassin's. It was a video game.
Yes.
And so the storylines weren't necessarily the main storylines that, we might be following in real life. And so simulation doesn't always have to be a simulation of a specific external reality. And so we may have games based on Lord of the Rings,
Mhm.
right? Which is, was named the #1 novel of the 20th century, right? And so many people have tried to simulate that, right? Peter Jackson in his films have tried to simulate what places like Rivendell, where the elves live, or where the dwarves are, the mines of Moria, what these things look like. And they use computer graphics, and then eventually there are games now where you can enter these worlds, whether it's Star Wars but with Lord of the Rings, it was just a written work, right? So people had to visualize. So you could be simulating something that doesn't exist, but you're curious about and want to experience as well.
Interesting. Yes, such Such big topics. One thing that I have posited as far as simulation is concerned, sometimes I think it's easy to, when we have a huge concept that we're trying to grasp, to want to put a template on it or over it, um, that corresponds with something that is relative to the time that we're living in. For instance, computers, computer simulations, so on and so forth. Um, but sometimes I wonder if I mean, that's just kind of our feeble way, for lack of a better term, way of looking at something that's much more maybe nuanced and complicated. Like maybe physical reality in and of itself is a simulation, coarse physical reality of something that is a lot less coarse. For instance, does any of that make any sense?
Yeah, I mean, this is very possible, right? The physical reality, as I mentioned earlier, when we run simulations, we basically simplify, which means, in a sense, we make it coarser, right?
Mhm.
In the same way that if you look at games in the 1980s, there were all these blocks, right? You look at Mario,
Yes.
Donkey Kong, and Mario, Super Mario, all these
Mhm.
games, right?
Mhm.
Right? And then over time, the graphics become better and better
Yeah.
as they try to approach some level of realism. So yeah, that's very possible. But the other part of your question that's interesting and relates a lot to my work is this just a metaphor, right?
Mhm.
Um, and I like to say yes. And we say, is it not a metaphor? Is it trying to simulate reality? Is there a real reality of the simulation? And I say yes to that as well. And so, in my experience, first of all, metaphors are very important when you're trying to understand extremely complex concepts, right? I mean, when Einstein tried to explain general relativity, he gave that example of like a piece of foam with a bowling ball on it, right? So you can see the curvature
Mhm.
of space-time, right? But even more than that, when you look at the religious traditions of history, they all use different metaphors to try to describe the world, right? Whether you're talking about the idea of Maya or illusion,
Yeah.
right, which is one of the terms used in the Hindu, the Vedic traditions.
Mhm.
Now, it means illusion, and of course, in the Buddhist traditions, they also talk a lot about Maya
Yeah.
and illusion. But the subtler aspect of that definition, which some scholars have argued, is not just an illusion. It's like a carefully crafted illusion that we agree to, right?
Mm.
And so the best explanation of that I've seen is they say it's like a magic show. Right? If you go to a magic show, the guy's not really sawing that woman in half, right?
Yeah.
But you kind of agree to be amazed because it
Mhm.
looks like it,
Mhm.
and because that's the whole fun of being in the show. And so the illusion, the Maya, is a metaphor. Another metaphor is the dream metaphor, right? In Buddhism, it's used a lot.
Yes.
Particularly, when the Buddha first got enlightened, a woman asked him, "What are you?" And he said, "I am But," using a Pali word that's based on an old Sanskrit word that means to awake.
Mhm.
Right? And so this idea that if he's awake and saw what reality really is, the rest of us must be asleep and dreaming. And of course, in the Hindu traditions, the dream metaphor has been used for a long time. And so I believe that these metaphors help us to understand. If you think of the Bible or the Old Testament versus the New Testament, either one, they were written, down when, right, a long time ago. And
Yes.
so they had to use metaphors that would be understood by the people reading them. And the same was true of the Quran, right? Wherever you stand on this idea of divine revelation, whoever is receiving that revelation and then repeating it has to put it in terminology that people can understand. And the essence of reality may in fact be ineffable, right?
Mhm.
That's a word that's used a lot when describing near-death experiencers and what they feel. Something that cannot be put into words. And yet we have to put it in words. And
Mhm.
so we try to use metaphors as a way of getting around the inadequacy, of the words themselves. And so there was a spiritual teacher who came over from India about 100 years ago named Swami Yogananda, who wrote a book called Autobiography of a Yogi, which was one of the top spiritual books of the last century. And, Steve Jobs gave away copies at his memorial service. Sort of that whole generation of the
Mhm.
counterculture.
Yeah.
They loved Yogananda's book. He was kind of considered the first modern guru because he came to America and lived here. Now, he came over in 1920. And so he used a different metaphor. He used a metaphor, a new, modern, technological metaphor to update these old metaphors. And he said, life is like a motion picture with a projector on a screen. And he goes, yeah, the actors are not really dying, but the characters are. And so that life is like that. And you have to look away from the screen to see the light. So he was updating the metaphor. And so I like to believe that if many of these spiritual teachers of old, or even of recent memory, like Yogananda, were alive today, they would say the world is like a dream, but it's also like a stage play, like Shakespeare said. But it's also like a movie where we have a script and we're actors, but we also are the audience watching the movie. But we can also make some choices and change the script. And we're all doing it together. And what does that sound like? That sounds like a massively multiplayer online role-playing video game, in my opinion. And so for that reason, I think, yes, it is a metaphor that we can understand reality. Now, the one thing that I will say is when people ask me, do you really think we're living in a video game or a simulation? Like what's your bottom line? Getting away from the metaphor and say, do you really think this is real? And I say, what I think is real is that the universe is based on information, right? And there's a famous venture capitalist in Silicon Valley named Mark Andreessen, who was a co-founder of Netscape back in the Web 1.0 world, for those who are old enough to remember that. And he used to say software is eating the world, right? Because software was just becoming very prominent. And today, of course, every industry uses software for everything, right? Even if you're a scientist, you have to learn to program, even if you're studying something else. But what I like to say is information science is eating all the other sciences, right? Because in the end, what they're realizing is a whole branch of physics called digital physics, which is, we talk about conservation of energy, momentum, mass, but digital physics is all about information and conservation of information. And there was a famous physicist in the 20th century named John Wheeler, who worked with Einstein and Bohr and all these guys. And he was also the supervisor of Hugh Everett, who came up with the multiverse theory, which we can talk about in a little while. But he had a famous phrase called "it for bit," and what he said was, he tried to figure out what is that the fundamental nature, like what are these things that we call particles, right? We still have this illusion in our mind of the Greek idea of atoms, these solid objects, right? That are the atoms are the most indivisible objects, right? And they're next to each other. But the reality is atoms are not like small indivisible objects, right? They have 99% empty space. And then you've got electrons, which we like to think of are like planets moving around, right? But that's not right either, right? They kind of pop in and out, and there's an electron cloud. There's like a whole complicated thing. And then we think of subatomic particles as particles. But Wheeler came up with the conclusion that when you get right down to what is this thing called matter, what is a particle, that there's almost no such thing, that it's what it is a series of answers to yes/no questions. And what's a yes/no question? It's a 1 or 0. It's a bit of information.
Yeah.
So he said anything that's a bit, or that's an it, like this coffee cup, right, or chai cup, is actually made of bits of information at the bottom level, like those Russian dolls. You keep opening them up and there's nothing there at the bottom but a little bit of information, right? And that's what distinguishes one particle from another. And so I do believe that there is the metaphor of the simulation and the video game that is really powerful, and it helps us to understand reality. But then there's an actual fundamental aspect of reality, which is that it is based on information that gets rendered somehow for us. And that is pretty much like how we do computer graphics. That's, my day job was in the video game industry for a while. And that's how we do things. Yeah.
Do you think that there is some interactive element to that? Is there sort of a co-rendering that goes along with the nature of quote unquote reality? Like the perceiver, like the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, where the observer affects the what it's observing. Do you think that it's malleable enough for the person viewing it or experiencing it to have something to do with what he or she is viewing?
Yeah. So, I think this gets back to the fundamental question that I said earlier about the different flavors of the simulation hypothesis, right? And so in the NPC version, we're all code running on a computer. And so technically we're not really affecting things. The code is just running, right? In the RPG version, we are actually playing the game. And so we are watching it be rendered for us, right? And for us, even though we're inside the game, we're also outside the game. And to me, that version is the closest to this idea of the observer effect, right? Which is that, we watch or measure or observe a collapse of a probability wave down to a single possibility. Now, quantum mechanics is just weird, right? And Niels Bohr, had a famous quote. He said, "Those who are not shocked by the quantum theory could not possibly have understood it," right? because it just doesn't make any sense from a common sense point of view when we think of the world. And the best description of that is Schrodinger's cat. And Schrodinger came up with this. Erwin Schrodinger was one of the fathers of quantum mechanics, and wrote the Schrodinger wave equation, which is kind of the basis of much of it. And he came up with this example because this is ridiculous, right?
Yeah.
He was trying to show that this is ridiculous because a cat can't be both alive and dead. Like, okay, so most people know what Schrodinger's cat is, but
yes,
it's a cat in a box with some poison, and there's a radioactive material that has a 50% chance of unleashing the poison and a 50% chance of not unleashing the poison. So after an hour, let's say there's a 50% chance the cat is alive and 50% chance the cat is dead. So which is it? Common sense tells us the cat is either alive or it's dead, right? Can't be both. But quantum mechanics is telling us that the cat is in a state of superposition. Okay, and so what does superposition mean? Superposition is a superset. If people remember their algebra here or their math, a superset of the possible states. And so if we say the cat has only two possible states, yes, I know the cats could be sick. There's all these other things in reality, but in this theoretical case, the cat is alive or dead, right? As the two possible states. So when the cat is in superposition, it has both of those possible values, meaning it is both alive and dead. And that is what we refer to as the probability wave within quantum mechanics. And the observer effect says that only when somebody looks in the box does it take on one of those definite states. It goes from a superposition to a single position. And then the probability wave collapses. And so I think there's definitely an element of that. Now, the other explanation for that is the multiverse idea. We can get into that in a minute. But I think there's definitely something to the idea that we are playing the video game. And in a video game, the way video games work, if you look at video games in the 80s, they didn't look like they do today, right?
Yeah.
Now, why is that?
The technology wasn't as advanced as it is now. Computer processing was more primitive.
That was part of it, that the computer. But the other part of it is we weren't using the same techniques that we use today. And so today we use 3D models and rendering. So in the 80s, if they try to render all of the pixels in a 3D world, they wouldn't be able to. There's just too many of them. Right? And so what happened was as the computer processing speed got better, we could render more pixels. But even so, we still can't render all the pixels. Like there's a game called No Man's Sky, and it has 18 quintillion planets.
Wow.
Okay. So even if a video game company were to try to, draw out all these worlds, it would take them literally thousands, if not millions of years to do that. Right. And so what happens is we've optimized it so that we only render on the screen the pixels that you can observe. Right.
Yes.
So in the same sense that right now I can only see, your room, and you can only see, like here I am in my office, right? You can't see what's outside my office. So you don't have to render those pixels on your screen.
Yes.
And I don't have to render the pixels of what's outside your office there on my screen. So the rule of thumb is only render that which can be observed. And that's how we do 3D rendering within video games. And turns out that's kind of similar to the golden rule within the observer effect, which is only render that which has been observed, right? So until it's been rendered, it just exists as a state of information, and you don't have to use up processing speed. So perhaps this is what the computer scientists who look at the quantum mechanics problem say, is that it's an optimization technique. Right. I mean, physicists like to rely on what I call, dumb brute force, right? They just come up with huge numbers, right? But anyone who's been in the computer industry or is a computer scientist realize that it's all about optimization, right? The history of computers is how do you optimize? I mean, the fact that we can even have this conversation has only come about because people learn how to compress pixels. Even so, like if you've ever saved even if I were to save this screen as a TIFF file, an uncompressed file format, the file would be huge. That would be one frame, and we're running, let's say, 30 frames a second. There's no way I could send that over the wire, the internet, over the Wi-Fi to the physical wire to your computer. And so the only reason we can do this is because of compression and optimization, and we decompress as we need to. So it's all about information. How much information do we really need? How do we render that information? So that's my belief, that as players of the game, we are able to make choices, and so there is free will within the game, and there may also be elements of us not seeing the same thing, right? So, for example, I could change my background, right? And so you would see behind me, the Bay Bridge in San Francisco, or the Golden Gate Bridge, right? And I would look behind me and I would see something else. So theoretically, we're looking at the same scene, but we're seeing something quite different. And that happens in video games all the time. Because if you and I are in a field, there might be a dragon flying above us. But if you're level 30, you have the, show me hidden dragons spell. And I'm at level 2 and I just don't have that spell yet. I would be like, there's nothing there. What are you talking about? You're like, look, there's obviously a dragon there, right? Because we're two avatars inside the game. And so it's very possible that not only do we have an effect, but that we might also be seeing slightly different versions of reality at different times. I'm not saying we're all seeing something completely different, but it's possible that we're able to render differently, and then the server has to reconcile that.
Interesting. Something else that fascinates me too, you mentioned earlier going to the Monroe Institute and studying or experiencing these out-of-body states. Do you think, few layers to the question, do you think that the out-of-body state, being out of your body, equates to being out of the simulation? First and foremost. Also, I hear of experiences of people who have out of OBEs and who maybe are doing ayahuasca or DMT, and what they are seeing around them is much higher resolution than what they see in their day-to-day 3D reality. Is that another symptom of being outside of the simulation, which may be a different resolution than the simulation might be? Is it an interface problem, or is it what we're apprehending?
Well, so if you go back to video games, right? If you remember, I like to use this example because in the 80s, when you saw like Mario, it was always a third person perspective, right?
Yes.
You're looking at the character, or King's Quest, an early RPG adventure video game back in the day. You're looking at a third person perspective, right? So you have kind of a God perspective, if you will, of the scene. You're looking down on it. Then with today's games, we have typically there's 2 modes, or 3 you could call it, but let's say 2. There's the first person perspective, where you're seeing things out of the eye of the character.
Yeah.
Right. But that's kind of disorienting a little bit when people play video games on a 2D screen. In virtual reality, that's fine, because then you feel like you're actually there with a headset on. But on a 2D screen, it's kind of disorienting. So we take what's called a pseudo 3D perspective. It's not fully 3D, but you're looking down at your character, so you see the back of your head.
Yes.
And so and that actually helps us orient better, right? So think of those difference between the first person and that, let's call it, I don't know, 2.5 person, or whatever you want to call it. Looking down, there's actually a term for it. It's escaping me at the moment. You can flip back and forth between them in a game. Now, when you're outside, you're looking down at the body and you're seeing everything else. You can still see the scene around you. And so I view being outside your body as kind of like that. You can detach what's called the virtual camera, right, from the specific point of view that it's normally locked into. And so normally we are locked into a first person point of view, right? I'm seeing my hands, etc. But when you have an out-of-body experience, and not just in out-of-body experiences, you can do this in meditative states, lucid dreams, yoga poses, where for an instant you feel like you're kind of above your head looking down,
Mhm.
and it's just a little weird, and then you snap back into your body, right?
Mhm.
And so we have this idea of a virtual camera, and a virtual camera can be put at any XYZ location inside the video game. So even though you and I are in, the fields of, I don't know, of Minas Tirith in the Lord of the Rings,
Mhm.
right? In the Lord of the Rings online game, let's say, right? I can change the virtual camera and say, I want to see what's happening in the Shire with the hobbits, and the green dragon in,
Mhm.
right? And you can put the virtual camera there, so you can actually see what's happening there. You can start rendering that scene.
Mhm.
And so there's this ability, I think, to detach. And so I spoke at a conference this summer in Birmingham in the UK, which was an Islamic conference. And it was the first time I'd been invited to talk at a conference. It was a scholarly Islamic conference.
Mhm.
And I spoke about the Islam and the simulation hypothesis. And, there were all these, Cairo University, like all these European university scholars were there. There was actually Ayatollahs from Iran there, right? And we're talking about ensoulment. Like, what is ensoulment? This is a question that comes up in all the major religions. And of course, they were debating, when does it occur according to Islamic theology? Is it 40 days after conception? Is it
Mhm.
120 days? Same kind of debates we're having here in the US with abortion,
Yes.
right? Like, is it the moment of birth? And I said, well, I'd like to give a different definition of ensoulment, right? And ensoulment is when the player basically connects into the avatar, into their brain, or puts on the virtual reality headset and forgets about what they were seeing before,
Mhm.
right? And so it's kind of like in the Matrix when Neo, Keanu Reeves, puts in, the wire, and they put in the particular cartridge. And if you can remember that, then you're in kind of a supernatural state where you remember life before you were in here. But because that's ensoulment, is basically being attached, right, to that specific point of view and that specific body. And that's why, from that perspective. Now, when people report doing ayahuasca or DMT, and I will say I've heard this from a lot of people now, but I have not tried it myself. But they report seeing either ultra hyper fidelity colors, as you said,
Mhm.
or in some cases they report seeing actual grid lines, like in a simulation.
Yes.
I mean, some people have bad trips too, and they don't see any of that. So we have to qualify this with some people, right? Because some people take these, and I mean, ayahuasca is quite, if you follow the whole ceremony, it's quite a draining ceremony. People are
For
throwing
sure.
up. There's all kinds of things that are happening, right? But some people do see that, and so they've told me, yeah, if you take DMT, you can see that we're in a simulation. I think the first person to tell me that was Sean Stone, who is
Mhm.
Oliver Stone's son.
Yeah, yeah.
It was right after I had written the book back in 2019. We were having lunch with a group of people in LA, and he said, "Oh yeah, you can just see it for yourself." So yeah, I mean, I do think that they are starting to see what shamans call non-ordinary reality, right?
Mhm.
But in this case, it's sort of what are the frames of reality. Like, if you've ever been, going back to Yogananda's analogy of a movie theater, right? If you're in a movie theater, if you watch the screen, you're like entranced. But the screen is an illusion, by the way, right?
Yes.
There's not really anything moving on that screen. What's happening is that frames are being flickered, and if you move your eyes kind of into peripheral vision mode in a movie theater, you can see the flashes of each of the frames, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So, and then you look around and you're like, wow, everybody's entranced in the movie. And
Mhm.
so they're seeing some of the mechanistic ways in which reality is rendered, I believe. So yeah, I do believe that's part of what's happening there.
Interesting. Yeah. Sort of a Plato's cave effect.
Yep,
Have you heard of Danny Goler and his experiments?
I haven't.
Danny Goler had just accidentally, after having ongoing for 2 or 3 years, these experiences with DMT and entities that he came in contact in that state of mind. Somehow, I don't remember whether it was suggested to him or whether he just sort of stumbled upon this, but in the state of DMT, after doing a certain amount, he happened to have on hand, a certain kind of laser, and he was directed to point it at as close to a white wall as possible. And this has been repeated. And he's kind of
Wait, sorry, was the laser in our physical
yes,
reality?
yeah,
Okay, yeah.
yes. And you can order the particular kind of laser off of his website or a kit to build it yourself or whatever. But he has replicated this, and several people that he's kind of put out the open call for people to do this themselves and see what they come up with. When he's pointing at this blank wall, he is able to see code. This
Hmm.
code, like a grid of code.
Right,
Yeah,
right.
which
And
is
I've heard that from people who've taken, some people that have taken
uh,
DMT, not all. Yeah.
yeah, I
But
just find that highly fascinating.
yeah, that's really interesting. So if you think of a video game, for example,
Mhm.
if you watch it render, right, which used to happen more because computers are faster now, so it happens so quickly. But what would happen is that first there is the wire frame
Mhm.
that gets rendered, and then there's the mesh, which are like grid lines,
Yeah,
which is kind of like the green color of like the matrix. And then you render the textures on top of that. So everything gets rendered actually in sequence. It doesn't happen all at once, but it seems like it does because it's so fast to us.
yeah.
And so if you in old computers, you could see that happening, and you could see for a while you can see the grid lines, and then there's this period where you can walk through the walls because they're not fully rendered yet, right? I
Mhm.
mean, once they're fully rendered, then you have like an actual 3D object that you as another 3D object
Mhm.
cannot walk through, unless you're some super yogi with these psychic with these abilities. But it's interesting that what they describe sometimes reminds me a bit of that, where you're seeing the construct
Yeah,
actually being put together, and then have been trained since we were babies, right, within our physical mind to process things as objects, right? I mean, there's this element where babies can't recognize something as an object versus
yeah.
another object.
Mhm.
They have to be trained to do that. So what
Yeah,
is it that they're seeing? Is
exactly.
it just colors? Is it something else?
Yeah.
Right? It's almost like you have to kick in the programming
Mhm.
to see things as objects in the
Yeah,
way that we see them. Just like when the Native Americans saw these ships, they almost didn't see them because it was just such a weird thing, like cities in the sky,
mm,
cities in the water. It just wasn't part of their reality, and they weren't
yeah,
trained to see them, so some of them just didn't even see them.
exactly. And maybe you can even go back to that place. I remember hearing a story of, Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche. I don't know if you're familiar with him.
I've heard of him. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Um, Very, advanced, Tibetan Buddhist teacher, a reincarnated teacher, and there's a story of him sitting in a courtyard with another similar stature of person, and they just start bursting out laughing, just, I mean, going on and on and on and on. And somebody, I think, approached them and said, "What are you guys laughing about?" And then one of the Chungyam, I think, pointed to a tree, and he said, "They call that a tree." So I can't believe they called that a tree. Like, so that tells me that perhaps they're seeing a different layer of reality that's maybe beyond that tree, or maybe as you were saying, a different layer of that tree, like the grid or the skeleton or the who knows? But I just
Right,
find
or
it
the life force, right? Yeah, they're
yeah,
seeing it in a completely different way. Yeah, I
exactly.
mean, and there's also, the story of Ram Dass when he went to India and he met Neem Karoli Baba, who was
Mhm.
one of these Indian gurus, and he gave him LSD, and the guy
Yeah,
just popped the pills and was like, nothing's happening. I'm
yeah,
already
exactly.
like, it's like I can already see everything. This doesn't do anything to me, right?
Yeah,
And that's when he abandoned, the drugs,
yeah,
and became known as Ram Dass, right? After he
exactly.
studied with him.
And
So yeah, I think it's perceiving a different layer of reality. That's what these folks are doing.
that reminds me of a story of Terence McKenna, who, um, he wouldn't name the advanced Tibetan Lama who he asked this of, but he g somehow convinced him to try DMT. Because he wanted to hear what he thought that what was happening. What is this? What's taking place when you do this? And he did it, and he said, "Well, basically, you're starting the afterlife experience. You're basically sort of dying. You're going through the
Mhm.
phases of going to the bardo, but
Yeah.
then you're pulled back. You're still connected by your cord, so you're not allowed to do the full journey. So again, it's that outside of the simulation.
Yeah.
There's so many ways of looking at it. It's
Well, I like to think that it loosens, right? It loosens the connection, right, with
yeah,
the body. And so you might still be in the simulation, but you're seeing more layers of it.
that's
And
a good one.
perhaps when you actually leave, that's when you're completely outside of the simulation, right?
Mhm,
For now, you're still in it, but you're just perceiving more. And so you're able to move around and look around and see things that when you're in your body, it's almost like there's a lock that happens, right? And it loosens that lock, which is
mhm.
also what I think a lot of the Eastern traditions are teaching us to do, is everything that tightens our identification
Yes,
with who we are,
exactly.
is like, they call it the chains of karma, right?
Yeah, yeah.
But it's also perception, that is locked in a certain way.
Mhm,
So I think these things, whether it's certain types of meditation, pranayama, certain types of physical exercises, breathing, drumming, and in more extreme cases, DMT and other drugs, loosen those perceptions, and loosens how locked we are into that first person perspective,
mhm.
within the body. That's my best guess to how all that works.
Has your research or just your pondering taken you to the place of what, okay, if this is a simulation and we can just take that at face value, what is beyond that? Like where, for instance, if these are our avatars participating in the simulation, well, what's our real self? What is our real being? And what might that layer of reality comprise?
Hmm. Well, there's a lot of different possibilities there, and so I've kind of gone through these in other instances where, um, one of the possibilities, it depends on where you fall on this NPC versus RPG kind of continuum. It's more of a continuum, really, right? And if you're completely an NP, if you think we're all just NPCs in a simulation, which is what most academics or scientists who look into this tend to think, that then what's outside is probably a future versions, a future civilization. So it becomes an ancestor simulation.
Yeah,
So it's
yeah.
kind of like this, but in the future.
Mhm.
Uh, if you go closer, some people say, well, it's nothing like this. It's actually an alien civilization that is simulating us to see what might happen,
Mhm.
right? Or we are trying to create beings advanced enough, whether it's AI or humans, up to a certain point,
Mhm.
right? And then there are those who think, well, it's us. Right? We are outside the simulation, and we are playing Avatar. So now you get closer to the RPG side of the equation, and that's where I
Yes.
tend to be. And so, I tend to think that what we think of as the soul or consciousness is the player outside of this physical body. But
Mhm.
then, there may be something outside of that, right? And so that's where you get into the spiritual aspects of the
Mhm.
simulation hypothesis. And is it all individual sets of consciousness, right?
Mhm.
And then what's outside of that? And some people say it's God is outside the simulation, right? And that's where it intersects with like the biblical traditions, as well as the Islamic traditions, right? In the Quran, there are some of the passages I quoted in that talk that I gave earlier, that I talked about earlier, was, it says, we have set up this world as a pastime, as a game, as a sport and a diversion, right, for you. And then there's the real world, right, that comes after. And of course, in the Eastern traditions, there's the Bardo and the Buddhist
Mhm.
traditions, but you keep coming back
Yes.
to play the game more than once. And so, I think one of the things that most religions agree upon, right, is that this is not all there is, that there is something outside the physical world, right? And this is sort of the fundamental disagreement between science and religion, if you really get down to it, right? There's two, then maybe there's more than two, but one is consciousness exists outside the physical world. The second is that there is something outside the physical world, right? Maybe it's even a broader difference. And, as a science fiction fan, I like to quote Battlestar Galactica, where they had
Mhm.
the AI creatures, the Cylons, and one of them asked one of the heroes, "What is the most basic article of faith?" She's like, "What?" He goes, "That this is not all there is." Right? That, and when you get right down to it, basically almost all the religions are telling us that, right? And so for me, it's like the common layer across different religious. If like 100 people go to China and they all tell you different things about different cities, but they all kind of agree, about certain foods or certain things, you can probably say those are probably correct, right? Because
Yeah.
those are agreed to. The other ones, they may be peculiarities of specific places. They may have imagined it, whatever the case is. But you can say there's probably a place called China, and there's probably some elements of it that we can agree to, right? And I
Yes.
think, with both the religious traditions and the near-death experiences, there are certain things that, many of them agree upon. And I think that's the one that we can generally, agree to, that this is not all there is. But I tend to think it's us, right? We choose, in a sense, in the same way that when you choose a video game, you can choose your different character types. Like back in the day, I used to play Dungeons and Dragons, which
Oh
actually has
yeah.
become popular again now.
Yeah,
After
I know. My kids play it now.
Oh, really? Oh,
Yeah.
interesting. Yeah,
Yes.
after Stranger Things, there's been a resurgence.
Yeah.
And you have these character sheets, right? Where you say this is the race, this is the different. You roll the dice and you say my character has more intelligence, less strength, and the profession, right? And so I think we have these storylines that we choose before we get into the game, and the game of life. So for example, when I was younger, in high school, you could have asked me, what are you going to be when you grow up? And I said, oh, I'm going to be a computer entrepreneur, and then I'm going to be a writer.
Mhm.
And that's kind of what happened, although I was wrong about the ages, right? I thought I was going to be a software entrepreneur till 28, and then I'll become a writer. I mean, I didn't become a full-time writer till the age of 48, right? So 2 decades later.
Mhm.
But we often have these ideas, right? And they're unique to us, right? And they're not genetic, because none of my siblings had any similar ideas,
Mhm.
right? Even though they're all ended up in the computer industry, when you asked them, that wasn't like something that was like right within there. And none of them became writers necessarily. We grew up in the same environment, right?
Mhm.
And so I believe we choose these qualities, right? And those things are partly our storyline. That now we can still make choices within that storyline. Just like in a video game, I might say, okay, I'm going to be a wizard, learn some spells. There are certain quests or challenges, and those dynamically occur to us while we're playing the game, right? And so it says, do you want to accept this quest? Do you want to go find the jewels of Ragnarok, whatever the quest might be,
Mhm.
right? And that quest unlocks other quests, and you might decide not to do a certain quest at a certain time, even though it appeals to you. Like in my case, I mentioned how I went back at the age of 50 to do a PhD, right? Which is one of those things I could have done at the age of 20, like all my classmates who went on to become professors at MIT, right? As soon as we graduated, they went to graduate school, and I didn't. So it was one of those quests that I put aside, but I've decided to still go back and do it. And it was something that often appealed to me. So it's not like it was something that I didn't care about at all, but it was something that I just wasn't interested in doing like right now at the time.
Yeah.
And so I feel like in the game, we have these different quests, and they become more difficult or easier for us at different points in our lives. And that becomes the complex tapestry of the game of life
Mhm.
to play.
Well, and just because assuming that we are in a simulation, just because that is something that is, supposedly makes it an unreal sort of convoluted reality, does that mean that it completely lacks consequence? Are we still accruing karma or burning karma in this situation, even though, I mean, in the bigger picture, it may not have any real, quote unquote, real life effects?
Yeah, no, I think there are consequences in a sense,
Mhm.
because what's interesting, if you look at the younger generation, you talked about your kids, right? They probably spend more time playing. We were talking about D&D, but I'm sure they spend more time playing actual video games than probably we did as kids as well, right? And
Well,
so,
they used to. We kind of limit their time doing that, so actually they
right.
might play D&D more.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
That's great. But I saw a survey recently that said for the younger generation, like there was a video. Okay, so Keanu Reeves um, came out with a little video when he came out with the new movie, the new Matrix movie in
Mhm,
2021,
mhm.
and it had been like over 20 years, right, since the Matrix came out. And so he said he had to explain the plot of the Matrix to, the younger generation because they'd never seen it.
Yeah, yeah.
And he said, well, there's this guy and he's in a virtual world and he tries to escape and get out. And they would the kids were like, well, why? Why is he trying to escape the virtual world? Like,
what's trying to get into it?
What's the big deal? Right.
Yeah.
And so I just saw a survey recently that said, kids today, or teenagers, let's say, they count their virtual experiences that they've had to be as real as their real experiences, right? With their friends, they've interacted with them in virtual ways. Like to them, that's a real experience.
Sure.
So this distinction between what's real and what's not real, I mean, you can have consequences, right? You can interact with someone on Zoom and that still has consequences outside your life, right?
Sure.
And so the video game, depending on what's the purpose of the game, right? I don't believe the purpose of the game is Grand Theft Auto, right? That's not the purpose of the game. But perhaps that is somebody's storyline, right?
Yeah.
But the point is that, we can look at the traveler reports, like near-death experiencers who've supposedly died and gone outside the simulation. And, many of them tell us about what happens. And one of the things that some of them tell us about is the life review. Right. And I'm sure you've probably heard of that. But I'm good friends with a gentleman named Daniel Brinkley, who wrote Saved by the Light. He was struck by lightning back in the 70s. Famous guy, #1 best-selling book. And that was how I first heard about what he calls the panoramic holographic life review. And he said you have to replay every single moment in your life. But you have to do it from the other person's point of view, right? And so you replay and you have to see what the consequences of your actions were on other people. And so he was, a sharpshooter and he actually killed people in the military. So he had to see what it was like to, a bullet coming from him to what seemed like him at the moment. And then he had to see what are called the ripple effects. Well, what effect does that have on the person who died, their wife, their kids, right? And so, they're telling us that, well, we have to look at our deeds in a strange way, and we have to be held accountable for them. And, it turns out this is one of the things that is generally agreed upon across most religions. Within Islam and even in the Judeo-Christian tradition, there's the book of life and the scroll of deeds. And in the Quran, there's an angel that writes down all your good deeds in the book, the scroll of deeds, and an angel that writes down all your bad deeds. Now that's a metaphor, right? It doesn't mean there's 7 billion times 2 angels writing in the feather pen, writing in Arabic or in English or Chinese. But what it says is, you will see the scroll of deeds laid open before you, and you will be the reckoner, right? You will watch, and that's exactly what what the life review people tell us is. There may be the other angels or beings of light there with us, but we judge ourselves and are like, oh, I shouldn't do that because this is the consequences of that action. And so, when people ask me what's the purpose of the game, I said, well, the religions have been telling us that all along. First of all, why do we play video games? Well, it's to have experiences that we don't have otherwise, right?
Exactly.
And so for whatever reason, we can't have these experiences outside the game. But then secondly, how is the game evaluated? Well, they've been telling us that for years, but now because of modern technology, we can revive people who died. And we're getting better firsthand traveler reports, which is how we treat other people, right? And so what did you do with your life is a question that's asked often, right? Did you fulfill the potential you had? Did you have some creative ability that you didn't use? Did you paint because you love to paint, right? Did you express yourself artistically? How did you treat other people? And so these things seem to be the purpose of the game. I'm a big believer in that. And that's perhaps where I diverge from the scientific side, right? But what I like about the simulation hypothesis is that it's a common metaphor, going back to this idea. It's a metaphor that I can use when talking with physicists. I mean, they may not agree, but they can understand it. They're like, okay, we can discuss whether this is true or not, right? Some of them may say, well, there's way too much information. No computer could do this. Of course, they're thinking of of a 386 or something. That's what our computers are like, right? Compared to what a quantum computer or a quantum simulation of the universe could be.
Yeah.
But and I can talk with folks that are religious and people that are, the big group that I tend to spend a lot of time with is the spiritual but not religious crowd, right? You can talk about it with engineers and technologists in Silicon Valley who tend to be more atheistic, and so it becomes a bridge. It becomes a way to talk about these ideas and concepts in language that we can actually understand today. It also bridges the gap between the young and the old. I've had many people tell me, oh, the reason I bought your book was my kids were asking me, am I in a simulation? Are we in a simulation? Or they bought the book and their teenagers grabbed it to go read it first, right? Because they're like, oh, cool, video games, let me check it out, right?
Yeah. Exactly.
It's an interesting bridge, I think.
Yeah, for sure. I'm really hesitant, although I'm very tempted to go into the multiverse, but we're so close to the end of wrapping up. Perhaps that should just be chapter 2. But I'm curious, what kind of background did you grow up in? What was your family religious? Were they atheists?
Well, so I was born in Pakistan, which
Mhm.
is primarily a Muslim country, like 90 some percent. But my parents weren't they weren't super religious, but they were, I don't know, what would you call it, mildly religious.
Sure.
They were religious in that they believed in things, but they weren't strictly religious in terms of, a lot of the things that people hear about Islam is more cultural anyway, because
Sure.
depending on where you're from, and so it was never an atheistic environment.
Mhm.
But I grew up pretty much in the Midwest, right? So it was primarily
Gotcha.
a Christian environment
Uh-huh.
that I grew up in. And then, when I went to school, then you get into much more of an atheistic, like,
Yes.
that's kind of the training that they do in academia, right?
Mhm.
Teaches you. I was talking with Diana Pasulka, who I don't know,
Yeah.
you may know.
Yeah,
She
she
wrote
was on a
American
couple
Cosmic.
episodes ago.
Oh, she was on. Oh,
Yeah,
great. Yeah, I love Diana.
Mhm.
And she was saying how, because I was asking her, what do you think about all these miracles that are defined in these books like Autobiography of a Yogi, and she goes, well, she grew up believing this stuff because she was Catholic, and she her parents had a copy. Her parents were probably from that generation,
Yeah,
the 60s.
exactly.
They had a copy of Autobiography of a Yogi, so she said she believed it, and then she became a scholar of religion,
Uh-huh.
and they trained her not to believe it, right? So she
Interesting.
said, okay, those are just stories.
Yes.
And then later she went to the Vatican and saw the canonization records of Joseph of Cupertino, where literally thousands of people saw him float up, above them in the church, all the way up to the top of the spire,
Mhm.
out in the square. And she read like the devil's advocate's testimony, and she said, well, it's very possible that these things really happened, because, so she had to like detach herself from the academic training. Right. And that's kind of what I think, my journey has been like, because I've explored a lot of like the Eastern traditions,
Mhm.
uh, since graduating from college. And so I've had kind of an eclectic background when it comes to the religious side of things.
That's good, yeah. It's interesting how sort of scientism has become a religion without a deity in a sense, like, people adhere to it in a fundamentalist way, and it's so material reductionist, but people are so staunch about that, it's almost as seriously as say, a fundamentalist Christian would take the Bible as a literal, like, everything in there happened exactly how it said. But they don't see it that way because it doesn't involve a deity. They don't see it as a religion, but it has all the same trappings. Yeah, saying that there's one version of reality and that, and above all others, and to even question that is to be blasphemous.
Right. Yeah, it's true. So, I'm doing my PhD is in a field that's known as science and technology studies. And
Mhm.
it's about the kind of the social construction of science and technology. So
Mhm.
scientists don't view what they're doing as social construction, but just like the government is social construction, right? I mean, there's nothing
Sure.
in nature that says there's a House of Representatives and there's a
Yeah.
Senate,
Yeah.
and they have these rules, right? They
Yeah.
have to vote on, right? I mean, that is a social construction
Yes.
initially from the Constitution, and then later whole bunch of abstract rules that these
Mhm.
guys agreed to,
Yes.
and so scientists view themselves as perceiving fundamental reality, but really it's a social construction of how knowledge works, right? So it's about knowledge, and it's about the intersection of knowledge and power, like what things get funded. And
Mhm.
I've been researching professors that have studied UFOs is one of my
Mm,
projects,
cool.
and how there's taboos within academia,
Oh, yeah.
right? Because if it was just about reality, then there wouldn't be taboos, right? You should be able to study whatever you want,
Yep.
but that's not how it works, right? There's perceived stigma, and so certain topics are okay and other topics aren't okay. And academia is definitely like that,
Oh, yeah.
and I've seen that, just uncovered it in my research as well.
Mhm.
And so I think that's where this idea of scientism also comes in, because there are definitely areas that if like UFOs have gained a little more respectability in the last few years because of
Mhm.
the Pentagon and
Yes.
Congress, etc. But it's still a pretty taboo subject to
Yep.
take. We call it the difference between the epistemological approach to looking at things and the sociological approach. So epistemology means how we know things, right?
Mhm.
And it's the sociological approach. It just says, well, these are just stories that people tell each other, like with religions. It's okay to study religion, but you can't believe in the ontological reality of
Yeah.
it, right?
Ex
These miracles may not have actually happened. That would be
Yes.
believing that was a real thing. But what
Exactly.
we're studying is the sociological approach of how do people talk to each other about religion? How do they come to believe things? Those types of things. And so
Mhm.
studying UFOs has been okay as a sociological phenomenon. It's been a little taboo, even that. You can ask Diana about that, right?
Yes,
People
for
are like, why
sure.
are you studying such a weird topic? But
Mhm.
as long as you study it, well, these people are weird. They believe in UFOs. Look at these strange cultists. Let's study them. That was okay in academia, right?
Yeah, of
But
course.
studying it like, oh, these people may have actually seen something that's real, like a real ontological phenomenon.
Yes.
That's what caused John Mack to come up with the phrase. I don't
Yeah.
know if he came up with it, but he certainly popularized the phrase ontological shock,
Mhm.
right? When you realize that reality is not what you think it is, right?
Exactly.
And I think J. Allen Hynek, who was in Project Blue Book and was one of the first scientists to really get in and study the subject. He would say we tend to forget that from 20th century science that there will be a 21st century science, and then there'll be a 30th century science, right?
Exactly.
And I think from that perspective, what we think of as reality is probably laughable, from a 30th
Absolutely.
century scientific
Yeah.
perspective. I mean, think of 900 years from now. I mean, we didn't even have a science
Mhm.
900 years ago, right?
Yeah.
In the
Exactly.
way we look back at leaching, right today,
Yes.
medical science, that's how they're going to look back at our science.
Exactly.
One of my favorite scenes is when you have in Star Trek, The Voyage Home, where Kirk, Spock, and McCoy come back to the 20th century, and McCoy is in the hospital, and they're going to do surgery on this guy, and he goes, "You don't have to cut him up, man," right? And he just like kind of cures him with a little laser or a little light or
Uh-huh.
something, right?
Yeah.
But it's like that kind of view, like
Yes.
today people don't realize that's kind of what we're doing is
Yeah.
a very primitive kind of science. Yeah.
Absolutely, and I think many scientists and people in general tend to be short-sighted as far as that's concerned, and they don't contextualize it in the bigger picture like that. They get all puffy-chested like, "Well, science says blah, blah, blah." It's like, well, now they do, but what are they gonna say in 5, 10, 15, God, 50 years? Like, this is gonna be ridiculous at that point. So, it's just silly. That's why I when I see people what epitomizes scientism is basically parroting the the mainstream theories about stuff as if you went out and did the research yourself and thinking that the boundaries of reality stop at those definitions, at those current definitions. And I just think that that's so silly, so kind of infantile. Like, have some humility, people. Come on. Like, we're all learning here. This is all a work in progress. Like, just remain open minded, like, let's study UFOs. Let's study people who have had these experiences. Like, what can it hurt? Let's broaden our
Yeah.
horizons.
Yeah, no, I agree with you 100%. I'll give you another example. I think this appeared in Diana's new book, Encounters,
Yes.
where there was a group, a SETI group, like I think called Breakthrough Listen. They asked a group of Native American scholars to craft a statement about what they should know about first contact,
Mhm.
right? And, of course, the Native American scholars, knew about the traditions from various indigenous communities. And, the SETI people told them at one point, no, you can't say anything about the fact that contact might have already been made, right? And so it was this, yes, we're open to another perspective. We call it like a different epistemological perspective, right?
Yes.
Native Americans have a different way of knowing that's
Mhm.
more intuitive,
Yes.
right? And it's based on stories and everything being alive. It's like a different different way of knowing about the world. And so, academia today says, well, yeah, we are very open-minded about different epistemological perspectives. But that's a perfect example where they said they were open, but then they said, no, you can't talk about that because that's against what our epistemological approach and what our definition of reality is.
Yeah, it's so
and so it was interesting to me, that little story, that little anecdote.
Yeah.
Exactly. They're not really open to another approach, because another approach would look at things differently. It would actually have a qualitative perspective.
For sure. Again, it's what the observer brings to what they're observing. Like, that's so important, so utterly important. And this is sort of related, but it's a funny another Terence McKenna observation that is like, you're talking about SETI sending out these signals to the galaxy, trying to find intelligent forms of life. Sending these signals out is like searching the galaxy for a good Italian restaurant. Like, there's not going to be Italian restaurants out there. Like, they're not going to, probably not dealing with the same sort of technology that we are, just like when Carl Sagan, and I forgot who the woman's name was, recorded this vinyl LP to send out in space. It's sort
with
of
music and other things, right?
Whale sounds and stuff like that. It's a great idea. I love the idea, but it's kind of, I don't think they're going to have a turntable out there.
Right, or the standards by which we record these things.
Exactly. And that all of those recordings are completely out of context. Like, who knows what they will think classical music is, or humpback whale. They might think that's our language. Like, it's just, it's funny. It's just interesting. And us humans, we're a funny lot. Okay, so I want to be respectful of your time. You're so generously agreed to do this, even though you just got done on a big road trip and you're feeling under the weather. So I appreciate you doing this in the first place. The books that we most talked about are two of your books, The Simulation Hypothesis and The Simulated Multiverse, which we really didn't get into the multiverse. We're going to have to do this again if you're willing to do that. But you have a more recent book out, Wisdom of a Yogi. Maybe you can tell people where they can get your past books, and maybe a little bit about your most recent book.
Yeah, absolutely. So they can go to my website, which is zenentrepreneur.com, which is based on the title of my very first book, which was called Zen Entrepreneurship. And it was kind of my story of living this double life where I was an entrepreneur by day and I was exploring consciousness stuff at night. And from there, they can download free chapters, and there's various links. And of course, the books, including Wisdom of a Yogi, which is basically relooking at ancient Indian wisdom from a modern perspective. Right. And the subtitle is Lessons for Modern Seekers from Autobiography of a Yogi. So I did a deep dive on some of the stories of miracles in that book, because it was such an influential book on certainly the boomer generation. In fact, at one point, it was, called one of the 10 most passed around books. They would literally just pass the paperback book amongst themselves. And of course, the boomer generation was an influence on my generation, which is Gen X. They were our mentors. So therefore, we got exposed to it. But a lot of the younger people today, haven't been exposed to some of those same ideas. And so I was asked on the 75th anniversary of that specific book, publication by HarperCollins India, to write lessons that modern seekers who are more familiar with video games and social media and mobile phones and YouTube than they are with, buying books and reading them. And these ancient ideas. So that's what brought that book about. And we can certainly talk more about that another time.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yes. So at least a couple more times, if we can get you to come back to finish what we didn't finish with Multiverse, and then to talk about that book. Of course, by that time, you'll probably have a new book out. Are you working on anything else, actually?
I do have some additional books, one of which is mostly done, and one of which I'm just starting to write. So one of those is a simulation book. It's called, tentatively called God and the Simulation. So it's about how different religious traditions, how they intersect with each other and with the simulation hypothesis, and why. And I've touched on that today, why they're all telling us that we live in something like a simulation. And then I have a sequel to Zen Entrepreneurship as well.
Oh, cool. Nice.
I've just finished up. Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, I look forward to those, and I look forward to reading your latest and having you on again to talk about the multiverse. Thank you so much, Riz, for coming on. I hope that you feel better very soon. Get some rest, and I will let you know when this comes out. If you could just leave your browser window open until it gives you the okay that the video and the audio have uploaded to the server where I can download them later, that would be fantastic.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, thanks so much for having me on.
Absolutely. I enjoyed it very much, and good to meet you. And let's do this again.
Sounds great.
All right. Take care, Riz.